I think there is a risk that the left gets very, very angry and starts to be really, really aggressive and accusatory towards people who might be voting for reform. You want to get progressive change in the next election, you need to win people over. And I think you need to be really careful to resist the temptation to go around shouting at people, calling them racists. Listen, there are racists in this country. There always have been racists in this country. I totally understand the instinct of people on the left to worry about increasing racism in society. I think it's happening. I can feel it happening. You need to be pragmatic. You need to be sensible.
So I guess this is the week where I criticize other YouTube channels. And today we are going to be offering a good faith critique of Gary's economics. Now, if you've subscribed to me for a long time, you know I often criticize other like left adjacent YouTubers. And what I don't want this to serve as is some sort of like personal attack against him. There are things I do want to talk about in regards to maybe his personality a little bit, but I want to mainly focus on his arguments around inequality and how we solve inequality, because Gary is single-mindedly pursuing wealth taxes and trying to influence the government to put taxes on wealth. And I'll explain that to you and what he actually wants in a bit more detail a bit later. But a lot of people I know like Gary's economics. A lot of people have even asked me what I thought of him and stuff. And I actually first got exposed to him from like these YouTube videos that spoke about like London traders, because he was a trader in London and he essentially quit, but he came out with a book afterwards and he spoke a lot in interviews about what it's really like to be a trader, especially from someone who is from a working class background, I think in Ilford in London. So it was an interesting look at a world that working class people don't traditionally get to see. And the book became really popular, and since like the last 5 years, he's become a regular on TV. He's written articles for like loads of different outlets, and now he has a YouTube channel which has exploded in popularity. And he tries to be, I wouldn't call it politically neutral, but he said himself he wants to make his channel as welcoming as possible to basically anyone who has an interest in what he's saying. Now, recently, you might have seen criticism directed at him for his comments about Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, and reform voters, and basically how unhelpful it is to call people like this racist. And what I guess people on the left who are watching this video would understand it as is some sort of class reductionism. But the weird thing about Gary's economics is, although you can view it as class reductionism, he actually isn't offering through his message like a coherent like political message beyond wealth taxes. So it's not like he's talking about making your workplace more democratic and trying to help with worker co-ops. He's not even talking about that. He's literally purely talking about a very, very limited wealth tax. And I guess if my criticism could be summed up, it's that I don't think the idea he's putting forward will even solve the issue he wants to solve. And it's also a very limited way of combating it. And if I was going to be like single-mindedly pushing one message, how to solve income inequality, this form of wealth tax is definitely not what I'd spend my time trying to influence the Labour government into doing, which I also think is pretty fruitless, because I don't think a wealth tax implemented by this Labour government will actually solve anything. And yeah, although rich people will lose money, what will that money be used for? I just think there's a lot of other things you could push on your channel which would be more helpful. And also with the platform he has, talking about like how he doesn't want economics to be seen as a right or left issue and stuff like that, even though you can pretty much tell from his rhetoric he does lean left, I just think it's not really helpful in changing people's mind. Along with the class reductionism, you're just going to get loads of people on board for a wealth tax. And if Labour do a wealth tax, what is next with Gary's economics? And I'm sure he could answer that. But I just feel like this current issue, and you can critique my point as well, I just think if you're going to die on the hill with one issue, there are better things to do than this limited wealth tax and selling it to people as something that's actually going to solve income inequality, while not really dissecting the elephant in the room, which of course is just the general system of economics we live in today. And Gary's answer to capitalism essentially just destroying the globe is to reform it in the most limited way possible, which I just don't think is going to really help with anything. So that's coming up for you in the video. Please give this video a chance before you knee-jerk attack me in the comments because Gary's your favorite YouTuber. And I'm not saying he's a bad person. I'm not saying every single thing he's ever said is pointless or useless. If he does bring people over to the left, then that's a good thing, of course. And I like his message generally on a lot of things. But just, as a socialist, I just don't really find his arguments that convincing. That's coming up for you today. If you like the video after you've watched it, please like. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Blue Sky and on Instagram. And if you want to support my work, please check out my YouTube memberships and check out my Patreon page. So before we get into Gary's recent controversy and why he's been criticized by people on the left for seemingly downplaying racism, let's talk about this wealth tax he's been banging on about non-stop, because he has said himself he's a single issue voter and it's this wealth tax thing. And he's using his entire platform, his massive platform, to get people on board for the wealth tax, and he's trying to pressure the Labour government to implement this wealth tax. So let's hear him articulate exactly what this wealth tax looks like.
You say tax the rich, but what does that look like? All right, so tax wealth not work. It's not about taxing high-earning individuals. We're not talking about taxing doctors or lawyers. It's about people with enormous amounts of hoarded wealth. So individuals and families with wealth of 10 million, 50 million, 100 million, £1 billion. These guys make like 5-6% a year on their wealth anyway. I would like to see them taxed 2% a year, 3% a year. To be totally honest, that's not enough, because even if you tax them 2-3% a year, their wealth is still going to keep growing. You need to understand, we do not live in a rapidly growing economy. So if the wealth holdings of these guys are growing and growing and growing and growing, it's coming from somebody, it's coming from somewhere. And it's not a coincidence that at this time of massive growth in the wealth of the very rich, you're seeing government being effectively bankrupted, middle class not being able to afford homes. These are the same thing. These are the same thing. I'm not even trying to redistribute. I'm trying to stop the redistribution that is happening from the working class, from the middle class, from the government to the very rich. You need to tax these very wealthy wealth hoarders really at quite a high amount to stop them from growing and growing and growing their wealth, squeezing out the middle class, squeezing out government. That's what I want to do.
So I think a lot of people will hear that message and they will totally agree with it, because yes, there are so many wealth hoarders in the UK who just sit on a pile of money, and he's proposing that on wealth over £10 million, you tax them like 2-3% a year. He even admits in the video it's not enough, which then you have to ask about, why aren't you proposing way higher percentage numbers? If we're actually going to try and influence a government to do this, if they actually do 2%, well, it's not enough anyway. So I don't think they're going to do 2% and extend it. I think in Norway, which does have wealth taxes, it's about 1% or something. So I feel like he recognises the limitations, but he does point out a real issue that the wealth is being extracted from working people and middle class people. And essentially, because the upper class don't pay their fair share of taxes, we are disproportionately funding this country while they benefit from it and get away with just hoarding these wealth and resources. I don't like the framing that the government is going to go bankrupt. I don't like people which Gary does, who phrase the government's budget as some sort of personal finance or someone's own bank account. You see the news media do this all the time. There's no money left, because that's how they get you and say to Jeremy Corbyn and other socialists, the magic money tree. How are you going to magic all this money? Margaret Thatcher says socialism's great until you run out of other people's money. That is how the arguments get used against the left, by normalising this rhetoric around the economy. We're talking about the government and obviously the Bank of England, the people who print the money. It's not the same as household finances. But beyond those general critiques, I think people can all get on board with, we pay disproportionate tax. The wealthy don't pay enough tax. We should tax them more. But obviously, if you are left-wing already, you realise the massive problem with this analysis, and how it's probably a bit too basic, is it's not just about the taxes. Yes, it is very annoying that you pay however much percentage of tax if you earn 30k, 50k, 60k, 100k, and these people who earn so much and sit on so much don't pay the same as you. That is very annoying. But then we have to also think about, well, why are these people so rich in the first place? It's wealth extraction. And the wealth extraction from the middle class and working class isn't just because they're taxed too much, it's because of the economic system we live in, where yes, bosses, CEOs, all these people, they extract your labour value and they don't pay you fairly for your labour, and their profits are in part stolen wages, and that is something you want the critique on as well. But yes, Gary is focusing purely on tax. So you can already see that I have some of my issues with focusing on a very limited 2% wealth tax. As part of Gary's crusade for this wealth tax, he doesn't want to alienate reform voters because he believes that because of worsening economic conditions, people who support reform purely do it because of economic hardship, and that they can be reasoned with, and you can reach out to them and you can get them on board with the wealth tax, because we need to sell them a different narrative, not one about immigrants ruining the country, but about the elites ruining the country. Now, I'll let Gary speak for himself first, and then I'll play some of the criticism, and then I'll talk about some of the criticism and my own opinion on class reductionism, which I think is even more useless if you're only doing it to talk about something like a wealth tax. So let's listen to him talk about it and listen to some criticism.
Listen, I'm not saying that Farage or Donald Trump are racist or fascists, right? I'm not saying that.
I
right?
am, but
okay. I think there is a risk that the left gets very, very angry and starts to be really, really aggressive and accusatory towards people who might be voting for reform. I want to show you a clip which I saw on Politics Joe the other weekend. So let's run it.
Wealth tax or no wealth tax?
It's a very hard one. I mean, I come from a working class town. Everything in kind of reforms policies would maybe leaning more towards no wealth tax.
So for me, if the wealth tax was possible, I'm at a stage in my politics where I would actually support it.
There are a lot of reform voters who'd be supportive of wealth taxes. If you want to get progressive change in the next election, you need to win people over. And I think you need to be really careful to resist the temptation to go around shouting at people, calling them racists. Listen, there are racists in this country. There always have been racists in this country. I totally understand the instinct of people on the left to worry about increasing racism in society. I think it's happening. I can feel it happening. You need to be pragmatic. You need to be sensible. Reform are going to win the next election, and you are not going to stop that by turning around and calling people racists. You need to be relentless and aggressive in your pursuit of common ground and unity. And that means you're willing to go to people who you might not agree with everything about and say, listen, I know we don't agree on everything, but let's find the thing that we do agree on. And let's fight for that. Because those people at those protests, they, just like you, are struggling to pay the rent. Their kids are struggling to pay the rent. They're struggling to find economic futures. If you centre that, if you focus on that, you can build something positive, you can win them over. If you focus on what divides you, all you're going to do is make this country more and more divided.
Hi, Benji here, and inspired by this clip, this is why class-first solidarity upholds white privilege. In the following video, economist Gary Stevenson has argued that the spread of far-right politics won't be stopped by focusing on race and racism, but rather by addressing the economic injustice that unites the majority. Often made claim that economic struggle is common ground that unites all of us is correct. However, class-first solidarity will always uphold structures of racism because it treats socioeconomic inequality as if it's a neutral universal experience, when in reality economic hardship isn't experienced evenly. Global majority communities face additional race-driven barriers that compound their economic struggles, from insecure housing to wage gaps, employment discrimination, and more. By treating racism as something to set aside to find common ground, class-first approaches erase these realities, and in doing so uphold structures of white privilege and white supremacy. It also can't be ignored that racist narratives are used to redirect economic frustration toward migrants and racialized groups. Sidelining race allows such strategies to persist unchecked, keeping global majority communities at a disadvantage while protecting white privilege. Solidarity can't and shouldn't be built by sidelining the realities of race. True solidarity is intersectional, built not just on the rhetoric of common ground, but on shared practices that ensure no group struggles are ignored and deliberately include those most often excluded.
So I agree with the critique of Gary there, and I want to expand upon it. I want to add my own critiques to it, because yes, I have a problem with class reductionism, just generally, without talking about Gary here. Class reductionism, when I hear people talk about it, just seems to think that if you make people's material conditions better, then they will automatically not be racist, for example, or they'll be less likely to be racist. And I think that both ignores history and just general societies, let's say Scandinavian countries, that are still really racist, even though it has a more equal society than the UK, for example, right? It doesn't stop the racism and it doesn't stop the xenophobia. And Also, it ignores like the history of like capitalism generally and how the poorest people in this country are people who are from minority backgrounds. And also, if you're trying to make this broad message, what white leftists in England, don't know if I'd even call Gary a leftist, but let's lump him in for this. What they often ignore is that some of the poorest people in the country and the most working class aren't white working men, but they always put white working racist men often on a pedestal. But then it's like, do you not think about the support you'll lose for the wealth tax even if you don't like call out actual racist and bigotry? But because this video is about critiquing the limits of a wealth tax anyway, but even if you're talking about how it will make our society better, you're not really doing much to convince the people who will benefit the least from that, like let's say poor minorities, the poorest in England who are working class, that this will actually benefit them at all. If you're making this argument, what is the incentive for them to ignore racism, to support this wealth tax and, you know, coordinate or collaborate with people in like reform or people who might support reform? There's literally no incentive because it's so limited. So that's what I find interesting about Gary's overall argument. He's basically telling leftists basically not talk as much about racism or, you know, gender stuff and just focus on the economic thing. But his solution to the problem isn't even one worth doing that for. Like, you're asking for a wealth tax. And also, I would say that if you're talking about electoral politics, we've seen many, many times that people who are more inclined to be racist will often vote based on their economic conditions, and they will ignore the cultural stuff they don't like. I remember this article I read ages ago. It was called like The Racists Who Voted for Obama, right? So it's like the 2008 election. These people who literally referred to Obama as a racial slur voted for him because they liked his economic policies better. So Gary might think that proves his point that yes, you can appeal to these racist people through the economic side. You can, but did Obama then pretend he wasn't for all the good stuff that he was campaigning on in 2008? I think this actually goes against Gary's argument that if you present an economic populist message and you preach more anti-capitalism and collectivism, you will get the working class on side, regardless of their views on other things. Yes, sure, maybe some of the hardcore supporters you're not going to reach and stuff, but I would even question what their support is worth, because it seems like they're probably not voting based on economic grounds. Because people will vote based on their class, but I don't think that means you have to then ignore actual issues that are related to class, like racism, things that enforce class dynamics, and also things that our economic system is even built on globally and at home, and that is structural racism. So while I agree, I wouldn't tell the Labour Party, who are campaigning in places that are going to vote reform, going around and telling everyone at the door, you are a racist if you don't support us. I don't think anyone would campaign on a message like that. They would put forward the policies to benefit them economically. That's all well and good, but that doesn't mean, as part of a general platform, people have to pretend they don't care about race and racism. While class is really important and identity politics has been completely weaponized to support woke fascism, I've made a whole video about how identity politics done by liberals leads to woke fascism, actually talking about racism and the inequality of society because of racism and gender is also an economic analysis, and you can't just separate the two, as people like Gary and many, many other white working class leftists in the UK like to do a lot. Again, I am the guy who's made a video about how identity politics leads to fascism, and I'm saying this, right? So that is the most viral critique I've seen of Gary recently. Like, this is a very recent thing. People saying, like, how can you not say Nigel Farage and Donald Trump are fascists and racist? But I also think a lot of what Gary does is very calculated, and I would say, if I'm going to get a little bit personal, I think he's a bit delusional about himself and how smart he is. Not saying he's not smart, and certainly he probably knows a lot more about the financial world than I do. But also, if you guys know any finance bros, when it comes to politics and the political assessment of the economy, I find them often to be very lacking. Again, I'm happy to admit that Gary probably knows far more about the economy than me. A successful day trader, knows all that good shit. But at the same time, he does seem naive in politics, and he does seem to have a bit of an ego about him on how much power he actually has. But then he's also thinking part of the reason Labour are not doing what he says is because they need to be convinced on the argument.
I study economics, right? So if you study economics, you don't do any inequality. So people from outside economics maybe watch my channel and think, oh, that's obvious. Inequality is like, if inequality rises massively, of course living standards will fall. What I want people to understand is most economists don't believe that. That is the thing. And this is the big problem that we're coming up against, really, which is the economists are wrong. And they're stubbornly hanging on to this idea that you can just sort of sensible your way out of this. And And I'm at this point where I've kind of won the public, and I'm kind of thinking, how do we break into this this kind of elite space of economists, including like economists in the Labour Party? And at the moment, if I'm being totally honest, and like I've done some research on this, I don't think they like me, the economists in Labour and a lot of sort of prestigious economists. And for that reason, it's very easy for them right now to be like, oh, fuck wealth taxes, that's Gary's idea and we don't like Gary. And what we need is more people saying it so that it stops being that's Gary's idea and starts being common sense. And I think for me, it's stressful, the idea being like Gary's economics idea. I would rather just people understand that and then we can push it.
They don't need to be convinced on the argument. They know wealth taxes would help things, and wealth taxes would help inequality and could be used to fund lots of good things for everyone around the country. They know that. They just don't want to do it based on their own class interest. Like, Labour are bought by the rich and powerful, the same as the Tories and Reform. They're not going to be convinced by one YouTuber to fundamentally change their policy. So now let's get into this a little bit more. So he has so many videos and clips around social media, but I thought for this one, it would be important more for me to criticise him, for him to talk about why he wants a wealth tax. So when I initially heard him talk about wealth taxes, I thought he wanted wealth taxes so he could take far more wealth off the 1% or the 0.1% and use that to like fund the NHS, use that to fund like public services around the UK, use that to actually improve everyone's life. Like, that's what a lot of people, I guess, understand. When you talk about a wealth tax, that's what it's going to be used for. What seems to be different about his argument is he's not actually making that argument. I'm sure he would agree with that use of his policy. He's actually saying the only way to stop income inequality from getting so bad we can't reverse it is through the wealth tax. And I think this is actually like a far weaker argument than the one I initially thought he was making. So he did a podcast with Zach Polanski, who's the new left-wing leader of the Green Party in the UK. And I found it interesting why he spoke about why he thinks a wealth tax is the best thing. Then he starts talking about income inequality he's seen around the world in developing countries. So let's listen to him talk about this.
One video I did was where I said, if you go to, say, a very unequal country, like I went to Colombia a few years ago, and there's quite a few big cities in Colombia, and if you go to, or to be honest, any big Latin American city, what you see is this tiny, they always call it like the Zona Rosa, like this tiny little area in the centre, which is unbelievably wealthy, and then the rest of the city is basically a slum. And I come from Ilford, which is like a kind of poor area of East London, like quite far out, and it's becoming a slum. And when you look at London, what you can see is, you can see the physical shape of London transforming away from what London used to be, which was a middle-class city, which is middle-class housing all across the city, with middle-class services all across the city, to a very unequal city, with like a very, very wealthy centre and slums all around it. You know, I don't say wealth taxes to raise money.
Right.
I've never said that once. I've never said tax wealth to raise money. I say if you do not tax, you know what, I don't even want to reduce inequality.
Okay.
What I want is to prevent inequality from increasing to the point where the 1% own everything. That's what I want. Listen, I'm not an optimist. I'm not an idealist. Okay, I am a trader, and I bet on this.
Yeah.
Okay, and I am a very, very good forecaster of the future economy, and I can tell you with a very, very high degree of confidence, if you do not tax wealth, then the grandchildren of 90% of the country will live in the kind of desperate poverty that my grandmother lived in. It's as simple as that.
So let's talk about two of the points he made there. He's talking about he believes a wealth tax is the way to stop the UK from going back to like Victorian Britain or becoming somewhere like Bogota or just any developing city like Johannesburg or Durban or something like that. He wants to stop that. Now, I think that, in my opinion, let me know if people have a different view of this or you can think of an example. I think that fundamentally misunderstands economic development and also the UK's place in the world, because the UK is not becoming Victorian England and it's not becoming Bogota, because with these countries he's mentioning, these typically have been countries that have been the victim of global northern wealth extraction. So even somewhere like Colombia, but lots of Latin America, right? So a lot of these countries are still going through like capitalist development. And what you see in like the BRIC countries, for example, you see the 1%, you see the upper class, you see a middle class, think about a country like Brazil or India, then you see a massive drop off and just insane poverty in these developing countries, right? But I would also say that resembles something like the UK back in the day when it went through its own capitalist development. And as these countries develop even more, you see that in many developing economies. You see that in countries like China and Vietnam, managed by communist parties. They manage these capitalist economies, and they manage them way better than most non-communist countries. And these countries continually get better, standards of living improve. So they haven't reached the point of capitalist development that the UK is in. So I don't fundamentally believe the UK is going to ever enter like Bogota, Manila slum levels. That's just not happening. That is not a future the UK is entering anytime soon. Now, Gary has said that he's the only one who's basically seen this. He's the guy who has seen the iceberg on the Titanic. I think he literally said that in this podcast. And he's shouting at people like, this is what's going to happen if we don't do a wealth tax right now. And again, if you really think that London and just the whole of the UK is going to become like Mumbai, like a wealth tax, seriously, like I don't understand a wealth tax in response to like this country going so far backwards in terms of development that we have just like the most visible, terrible poverty that you find in typically developing countries. If you think that, then I would propose something far more radical than 2% wealth on people who own over £10 million put forward by the Labour government. That is such a limited thing, and it just, in my opinion, solves none of these issues. And if we are really heading towards this cliff of, oh my God, if we don't do this wealth tax in the next like parliament, this is definitely going to happen. I don't know why the solution isn't far, far more radical than get Parliament to pass a 2% wealth tax. So yeah, that is what I'm trying to talk about. This guy is like, it's very limited. I also don't accept the framing. What is likely going to happen in the UK is what is happening in countries like America. Like America, to a lot of us, is what the future looks like. Think about America. Think about the poverty in America. The poverty in America is far worse in the UK in terms of what it's actually like to be a poor person in America. Like no healthcare, lack of mental health services. But you wouldn't describe America really, in most places, like a slum, like Bogota, like Manila and stuff like that. And I feel like that is the future the UK is heading to. Not that that isn't a terrible future, but the future the UK is heading to is what America is now. It is an oligarchy that controls everything, where people are actually well off enough, like most people, and they have such an investment in the system, whether that be property or something like that, that they don't actually want things to change that much. And their standard of living isn't bad enough that they're going to have a revolt or something like that. And I've also talked about the rise of these apps like Klarna. I made a whole video on it, how these apps will sustain a consumer capitalist economy. And also, there's nothing stopping a government, even a right-wing one, like people like Elon Musk have talked about UBI before, to push things like UBI, especially with AI automation. So that will give people money, and that will prop up the Western-dominated consumer capitalist economy, meaning that while poverty in the UK will get worse, deprivation will get worse, as we've seen in lots of parts of the country. I don't think this doomsday scenario is happening. I do accept what Gary is saying about how the 1% will own everything. I do believe that as well, but I'm just rejecting the framing that if we don't do a wealth tax, we're going to go back to like Victorian England. And also on that note about the wealth tax, I saw Grace Blakely also speak about this as well. I don't think the wealth tax, like to push back on the wealth tax for a bit before we talk about it a bit more, I don't think it's any sort of solution to any of the problems he's talking about.
It's not enough just to say we need to tax the rich and that will inevitably make everyone better off.
The only real way we can change this is to tax at the source and then have a plan for it, right?
I'm on the left. I don't trust most governments. I don't trust them to spend this money well. They will dish it out to corrupt corporations. They'll use it to fund tax cuts or, you know, for other sectors of the economy, use it to buy weapons. And what I want to see is more democracy. Yes, I want there to be more taxes on wealth. But again, you know, a big part of the reason for that is that I want a society in which everyone feels as though they are able to kind of input into the most important decisions that affect them.
So Gary has constantly talked about how he wants to like pressure the Labour government to do this. So let's say Keir Starmer, he announces at the next budget, we are going to do a 3% tax on people's wealth over £10 million. 3%. That is a lot of money for him to raise. But for Gary's argument, he doesn't care about the money it's going to raise to invest in the economy. He thinks that's going to slow down the rate of the 1% controlling everything. And I'm just like, increasingly like, how? Like how does a 3% tax on money over 10 million stop what they're doing? These people are so absurdly wealthy. I don't think, even if that did eat into their money, which he even said in his video we started with, it doesn't actually like even affect them really, because they make like 6% on the interest of that, just like sitting in a hedge fund or something like that. So yeah, it will push more wealthy people away from the country. Maybe it will make Britain a less desirable place for like these people to come here and like extract this wealth from the public and stuff. I just don't understand how that solves everything. So if you know, Richard Branson or all the royal family all start paying this money, how does that make my life better? Like inherently, how does that make my life better? And how does that actually stop them from ruling over us? It's such an inconsequential amount of money. And also, if we're going to talk about how it makes our lives better, so let's say the Labour government, they now have, I don't know, I saw a number floating around, it might be like 17 billion if the UK proposed a wealth tax that was similar to Norway's. I think like 17 billion more pounds a year or something like that, just from a 1% tax. So what would we use the 17 billion on? We've seen what the UK have been doing in terms of NATO and increasing the military budget. We have seen the UK fully embrace all this AI bullshit, like Starmer's announced this proudly. And we've also seen increasing crackdowns on obviously refugees, migrants, and even like with the Tories calling to make an ICE force in the UK. So in terms of a far right Tory or Reform government or a very, very hardline Conservative Labour government, what will they use the extra £17 billion for? Will they use it to transform this country and stop this inevitable future that Gary's economics is saying is going to happen? I just don't see how that helps. Yes, you could say that if it was a progressive government, they could use that extra money to fund public services, and maybe that would happen. But then at the end of the day, what are we propping up? We're propping up the status quo. How does the status quo fundamentally change from a wealth tax? It just doesn't. I know I am a communist, so you know what I think the solution is. But I just don't understand how this really changes anything about the UK. The poorest will still be the poorest. There will still be an elite, a rich elite in this country, like there is in Norway. There are still billionaires in Norway, and we will still have an unequal society, and there will still be vast inequality. And I don't think the gap would close that much through things like wealth taxes. I just don't think that happens. And then you're also trusting a Labour government to actually spend that to actually make sure inequality isn't as bad. Maybe you could say it's a good starting point, but I still think if you're getting all this attention on yourself and you really want to change this country and save it from the children of man future that you've been describing, why is this your main thing to talk about? I really, really don't understand. And his aversion to actually talking about politics in a more honest way just gets me skeptical and just makes me think this guy has delusions of grandeur in terms of he's a trader, he's made a lot of money betting on like the uncertainty of global economics, and he's done really well for himself. Apparently he still does trading as well. And he's the guy who's seen that if you don't tax wealth. And what I would say is I totally agree that taking wealth from the billionaire class is a very good and necessary thing that needs to happen. If I was him, I'd be talking about seizing most of the royal owned land in the country. I'd be talking about like radically changing the laws around housing. Like you can't actually own more than 2 properties, for example, something like that. Something really radical that really attacks the heart of people's wealth in this country, not simply 3% tax on like wealth over 10 million. Maybe Gary can prove me wrong. Maybe he's just looking for that incrementalist step. He says he's not like any sort of like socialist, even though he thinks billionaires shouldn't exist. So maybe he's looking for that and he's thinking, I can use my power to get this wealth tax passed and then we can build on it. We can build our movement. But I'm just thinking like the starting point is so like not what we need right now in terms of how radical the solution is. And even when he's talking to Zach Polanski in this whole podcast, I'm getting the vibe from Gary, like I'm just trying to read into it. He thinks he knows more than Zach. And I think Zach Polanski's like solutions and what he's articulated is far more compelling and makes way more sense to me and actually feels like it would change things than what Gary is suggesting. I feel like Gary is a blank enough slate for people that you can project a lot of your own political beliefs on him, but thinking that, oh yeah, he would support this. He keeps it vague enough where so many people can like him and project their own values onto him, while at the same time, I don't think he actually offers a solution that actually fundamentally changes anything about the status quo. And if I want to get a bit more cynical, you know I like doing this, Gary is a very wealthy person who still makes money betting on a system that fucks us all over. If you asked him point blank, Gary, would you significantly reduce your income, even your wealth holdings, and live a more modest life, what would he say? And that's why I'm always skeptical of more rich people pushing stuff like this, because I feel like when push comes to shove, there are a lot of rich leftists who I don't actually think would actually live a lifestyle that would be compatible with global equality because of the capitalist system. We all know in Britain we already benefit from wealth extraction from the global south. So I just don't really trust people making these arguments that just don't seem like to fundamentally change much. So there's one more thing I want to talk about. I've made some notes on a video he uploaded recently called "Is a Wealth Tax Possible?" I'm not gonna go through it completely. I'll try and show you a few clips. But what I found kind of weird is, for example, wealth taxes are quite popular anyway. I haven't seen the recent polling in the UK, but I think the majority of people support wealth taxes. So he talks about this movement he's building with Gary's Economics and getting all of these people to have this conversation and pressure the Labour government. But what also I find very uncompelling about Gary's arguments as well is he's talking about the tax policy. He doesn't actually have in mind what the tax policy is right now. So for me, that's one of two things. Either he's keeping it vague because he wants in the conversation, this is maybe what he's doing, wealth taxes. Just generally wealth taxes. Everyone get on board with wealth taxes. We're not going to specify anything. Just, support the idea of it. So, okay, let's say more of us support the idea of it and then Labour consider doing it. And then he's saying in this video, then people need to get together and work out what a wealth tax would actually look like because it's really, really hard. So I'll play you some clips.
The argument I'm making is correct. Inequality is increasing really, really quickly. The rich are rapidly increasing their wealth. It's squeezing everybody out. It's destroying the middle class. It's destroying the government. It's having and will continue to have really destructive effects on living standards. You need to fix it. 100% you need to fix it. The only way to really do that is to aggressively increase taxes on the rich. The truth is that's hard to do. So they should be calling me up and saying, listen, okay, we see it. You're right. We understand now. Okay, you don't deal with inequality. You're kind of but the rich are saying they're going to leave. We don't really, we don't think it's possible. You know what I mean? So then you call me up and you say, okay, all right, let's put the work in. We put the work in. We design this tax so that it's good, so that it's watertight. If people turn around to me and they say, okay, all right, show me the tax policy then. Show me the tax policy. I'm here in my kitchen, right, which is real, with a massive YouTube channel. I'm pretty obviously the world's biggest campaigner for wealth taxes, and I work hard, right? Do you think tax policies are usually made by YouTubers? If you want good tax policy, you need to pay good tax people, and you need to sit them in a room for a long time, and you need to make sure they design that policy. Even if I was the smartest guy in the world, you wouldn't want one guy. If you want good tax policy, you need to pay proper tax experts for their expertise and their time. And you spend 2 years designing the tax policy. Obviously, it's idiotic, this approach. Listen, I would be more than happy to be involved in making sure this tax policy is designed well, obviously. But the way that you do that is you get the tax experts, you talk to me, you talk to the other guys, you build a team of proper good tax experts, you think about the question of how do we deal with people who leave the country? Can we still tax them on the UK assets? Like we did to Abramovich, like China does. You look at how these issues were dealt with in the past. You look at how wealth inequality was reduced significantly in the 20th century. You have sensible discussions, but I'm constantly faced with these idiotically simplistic discussions, which are totally bad faith, which is okay, you've recognized that the ship's going to sink. Well, why don't you fix the hole yourself then, you idiot? It's just unbelievably childish and it's unbelievably chaotic. Listen, we're supposed to be adult, grown-up, mature countries here. I have correctly identified a massive problem in our economy that is going to devastate living standards if nothing is done about it. You need to fix that with well-designed tax policy, and well-designed tax policy takes experts, and it takes money, and it takes resources, and it takes hard work. So, and that is the message. That is the message. Especially talking about things like economics or politics. Especially when somebody comes in, they know their shit, they seem solid. So I was like, I think working class background is a big thing. But if I can say so myself, I think it's partly because I know my shit.
Right.
You know what I mean? So maybe you've experienced this. Or when I first started doing media, you get called to do. I was calling in and talking about inequality, COVID, cost of living crisis is going to happen, right? I'm doing really well, just my specialist subject. And then you get called in to do news reviews. You must have done a couple of news reviews, right? Absolutely. And I did a couple of news reviews. I think it might have been with Jeremy Kyle. So I did a couple of news reviews during COVID. And for those who don't know, you get sent at 6 a.m, 10 stories, right? And it's it's so stupid when you think about it, right? Because you know, you are an expert on your one thing. You know more about a wider variety of things than me. But in my particular case, you have like an exceptionally good economist. And in the morning, I'm running around like, oh, what do you think about this Prince Charles story? I'm calling people up, can you talk to me about immigration? I don't know anything about, you know what I mean? And I'm having to research all of these stories. And then you have to speak about them like you're an expert.
So if we're thinking he's playing like 4D chess, right, and he's just trying to get the wealth tax in the conversation, that's all well and good. But if that's not it, and he's actually like not knowing what kind of wealth tax he wants, I don't have an education in economics. My education is in politics. But I could articulate for you what my economic vision for solving Britain's like various crises are, right? I've already talked about some of it. I would actually take a lot of wealth off the royal family to start with. I would take a lot of their land. I would do that for a lot of people in the aristocracy. And I would also like crack down on people owning loads of properties around the UK. If I went a step further, there's tons and tons of empty buildings in London. I would start probably making like financial penalties for these giant corporations from other countries, making these buildings and not making them affordable, so they just sit empty. And there's loads of things like that I could articulate of how I want the UK to run in a capitalist system, how to make the country more fair. The fact that he's pushing a wealth tax without any specifics, to me, it's just like a red flag because, again, 4D chess, or he's just saying, I'm just a YouTuber. But you're not just a YouTuber. You've been banging on about how you're a great economist. You've literally said that in the podcast with Zach multiple times. You are a great economist. So if you are a great economist, lay out the solution. Lay out, please, how this wealth tax is going to work and how it's going to save us. Because your arguments so far are very, very unconvincing. I just don't buy them at all. I think a wealth tax is a tiny, tiny part of the solution. I don't see Gary's economics as challenging the economic system in any way. Wealth taxes are things that have been done by other countries. They're things that exist in other countries. And yes, they benefit society. But Norway still has the same problems as the UK. Norway still benefits off global wealth extraction. People in Norway still face similar issues to us in the UK. They just don't face them as harshly. The same way, in the UK, we don't face problems as harshly as the US. There's a spectrum in terms of capitalism and capitalist economics of what countries face the greatest hardships. And I've said this many, many times. Looking at Norway or Denmark or Scandinavian socialism, as people often call it, as some sort of end goal is not going to save us. It's not going to save the planet, but it's also not going to save society. And just for the Norway example as well, let's say Labour even pass a very generous 10% tax on wealth over 10 million, right? In Norway right now, they are debating over getting rid of the wealth taxes. And that's because loads of the capitalist class are working in politics and pushing a message to try and convince people to vote against it and vote for politicians who want to scrap it because they're saying it damages like entrepreneurship in Norway and it damages the general economy because they're all overtaxed and they don't get enough for it. So what's stopping that? If Labour pass a wealth tax this year or next year, Reform would probably still get in and then they just scrap it. And then what? What do we do afterwards? We're just back to square one. And I just feel like people like Gary's economics can be a very good entry point into politics. But then, because the whole thing is centered around himself, I think, which is very natural and it happens on YouTube, a lot of people will make their politics Gary's politics. We have people like Hassan in left-wing online spaces, and people make Hassan's politics their politics. If you criticize Hassan, and I've done it multiple times this channel, people get really, really mad and they don't want to entertain the critique because they think everything Hassan says is right. And especially if you're taking people who don't have any education on politics, any education on economics, you're listening to someone who speaks with authority. So for Hassan, he has a politics degree. Gary's economics, he's obviously got a lot of experience in the financial world, was very, very good at maths, went to the London School of Economics, so he's very well educated. So when someone like that talks about economics, you think he has all the answers. But I'm trying to say when sometimes, and I spoke to finance pros who I feel like this in my real life, when you don't have a political education and you don't understand class as much as you think you do, and you don't understand just general systems of economics and how they affect the globe, you can be so smart at the trading world that would leave loads of blind spots when it comes to the actual real world. And even though Gary thinks that he couldn't have them because he's from a working class background and he's entered the halls of the upper class through his career, I think he does have them. And I just think, unless this is all just something to make him more popular online and stuff, I just don't understand how the wealth tax is the goal. It seems to me as a very, very first step. And maybe he said this. I haven't watched all his content. He's all over the place. He's literally got like thousands of hours of content on YouTube. I can't watch it all. But from what he's boiled down on Zach Polanski's podcast, on other podcasts I watched today, it's the wealth tax. And he has never said the wealth tax is the first step into building socialism. Like I've shown you, he doesn't even say the wealth tax is about giving the government more money to do good things. He just thinks the wealth tax will stop the 1% owning everything. It really just won't do that. So I don't know why he's so hyper-focused on this. And if you combine it with the class reductionism, I just don't understand even the point of his campaign, to be honest. I know I'm a hater. I know people are going to hate my fucking video. But that's the critique of like Gary's economics based on what I've watched. If you are a massive fan and you have like a rebuttal to every little thing I've said in this video about him, then please leave it in the comments. And if there is enough evidence that everything I've voiced is actually wrong because he's actually addressed it, then I'll make a follow-up video talking about why I was wrong and why I came to these conclusions, but now you've shown me other evidence, and I will show that evidence showing how I actually was wrong and Gary was right. So if you're a massive fan, let me know. But yeah, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.